MoveOn.org just did a straw poll, and you'll recall I was talking about this earlier. Let's see, it was I think 2 weeks ago. We basically did an hour on Beto O'Rourke and what do you think of this guy, and is he the next Bobby Kennedy, and could he be the next president? I mean, it's a serious question, and when you look at the current president, Donald Trump, he was a political outsider. He's never held political office. He never run for political office, and boom, he's in the White House. The guy before him, Barack Obama, only spent 2 years as a federal elected official in the United States Senate, and most of those 2 years he spent campaigning for president. Before that, he had been a state senator in Illinois, but only briefly there. So arguably, with 3 terms behind him, 6 years in Congress in Washington, D.C., Beto O'Rourke has, a much fuller and deeper resume than Trump, politically speaking, setting aside the issues, and one that's not that different from President Obama. So anyhow, what happened was MoveOn.org does this straw poll, and they do these regularly, and this came in as rather surprising. The number one winner of the straw poll was someone else, none of the above. That was at 28%. But 15.5%, number one on the list, 15.5% of the people who responded to the Daily Kos, or excuse me, the MoveOn.org poll wanted Beto O'Rourke as the Democratic nominee for president. Behind that was Joe Biden with 14.9%, Bernie Sanders with 13.1%, Kamala Harris with 10%, Elizabeth Warren with 6.4%, Sherrod Brown at 2.9%, Amy Klobuchar at 2.8%, Michael Bloomberg at 2.7%, and Cory Booker at 2.6%. Now, this tells me a bunch of things. It tells me that Elizabeth Warren isn't anywhere near as strong as I thought she would be, and I'm wondering how much of that is the way that the media has dealt with her doing that DNA test stuff, or if that's just, maybe it's that she doesn't have that much media exposure. She's not on TV constantly. Joe Biden at almost 15%, Beto O'Rourke beating him by 0.7 of a point. But Joe Biden at almost 15%, is that there's really a groundswell for Joe Biden, or is that just name recognition this far out? I mean, we're 2 years out from the election. So, which is it? And what are your thoughts on this? Who would you like to see as the nominee for president on the Democratic side, and why? I think that there's a number of cases that can be made for Beto O'Rourke, and there's an interesting take on this in Axios's email newsletter this morning. They point out, first of all, the last 2 presidents have been disruptive candidates. And by the way, we're still operating under Reaganomics. The point that I keep making, and the corporate media obviously has not picked this up, and probably won't, because they're quite happy with Reaganomics, with giant tax cuts and all this kind of stuff, and suppressed wages and suppressed unions. I mean, you've got one of the television networks right now fighting their own unions. But the point that I've been making for some years is that we have, because we are still living in the era of Reaganomics, because no Democratic president and Congress has successfully overturned Reaganomics and taken us back to a top tax rate for very wealthy individuals of over 50%, which is where you stabilize inequality, number one. And we had that from basically World War, well, there was an exception in the 1920s, but basically from World War I right up until the 1980s, really 83, 84, I guess, when Reagan really did his first large tax cuts and took it below 50%. He first took it from 73% down to 50%. LBJ had lowered it from 91% down to 73% in, as I recall, 64. But number one, we haven't seen, nobody has reversed that part of Reaganomics, which is the largest structural piece. And number two, nobody has reversed Reagan's war on labor unions. Which has now been fought in large part over the last 20 years by the Supreme Court. They continue to have these decisions that basically, destroy labor unions. So the net of this, the bottom line of this, is because for the last 20 years, Americans have figured out that Reagan and the Republicans reconfigured the entire American political system in a way that works best for the billionaires. We've seen, and screws working people. We've seen, in 1960s, I was talking about this yesterday, in the 1960s, the top 1% and the bottom 90% both had a third of the economy, a third of the wealth in the United States. Excuse me. The top 1% had 33%. The bottom 90% had 33%. Now the top 1% have over 40%, and the bottom 90% are down in the 20s. As I recall, it was 26% or something like that. So what's happened is literally trillions and trillions of dollars of wealth have been taken out of the pockets of the middle class and put into the pockets of the very, very rich. So, as a consequence of this, Americans know what's going on, right? They've figured this out. And so Bill Clinton ran in '92 on his New Covenant speech that he was going to bring back the New Deal and he was going to end Reaganism. And then he didn't do it. And then, Al Gore didn't really talk much about that. And so it was kind of a in-between election. And George Bush, of course, only got in because his brother threw 70, 80,000 African Americans out the voting rolls in Florida. And then, of course, it took the Supreme Court to install George Bush in the White House, even though we know now in retrospect that Al Gore actually got more votes in Florida. But this was not an issue that was litigated in the 2000 election. So that brought us back to people wanting change again. And so Obama comes along in 2008 and says hope and change. And everybody's like, yes, we want a disruptor. But Obama didn't raise that top tax rate. I mean, this is not to knock Obama. He couldn't do it. He didn't have the majority necessary in the Senate. But he couldn't pull that off. And so then people are still saying, we're suffering out here. The rich are stealing everything. We want a disruptor. And Donald Trump comes along and says, I'm going to raise taxes on the rich. I'm going to stop the stupid wars. I'm going to change the neoliberal trade policies and bring our jobs back home. And of course, a lot of people believed him. They didn't realize that he had an entire lifetime, story as a grifter and a con artist and a liar. A lot of people believed him and voted for him, and he became president. But the reality is that he's not changing Reaganomics either. So we've got, from '92, when Americans first figured out, in a big way, as a result, I think in large part, those of you old enough to remember know what I'm talking about, of the Ross Perot candidacy, who came out and said, both George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton want NAFTA, and if we pass this, there's going to be this giant sucking sound from the South. That was Ross Perot's famous line. He was right. And Americans knew he was right. He got 20% of the vote for president in 1992. So literally, ever since 1992, Americans have been begging our presidential candidates to repudiate Reaganism. And nobody has done it successfully. I mean, they've done it rhetorically, but they haven't done it at the level of the law. And frankly, I think in 2020 that there's a very good chance that the pressure is building up so much. It's almost like a reboot of the whole Nixon era. The pressure is getting so high that it's possible that Democrats could take a supermajority in the Senate, a supermajority in the House, or at least a significant majority in the House, which is all that's necessary, and take the White House. And if so, we might finally, in 2021, see Reaganomics repudiated, reversed, changed. And so anyhow, the first point that they make in this Axios newsletter is that the last two presidents have been disruptive candidates. I would say, with the exception of George W. Bush, every candidate since 1992 has campaigned as a disruptive candidate, both on the Democratic and Republican side. But none of them have actually disrupted. And then they point out that, the poll, the Beto O'Rourke won the poll. And then they go into Beto's appeal. Mikhail Waltz, a major Democratic money bundler in Texas, said, we've had a politics of division for so long. See, this is hearkening back to Reaganism. Young voters are so turned off by that, and Beto is so unapologetically optimistic and forward-looking. There's a huge demographic swath that will get behind Beto just because he's different. You understand what's going on here? This is, disruption. People want disruption, and they think Beto's the guy to do it. Now, he oddly enough, he was not a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. He was a member of the New Dem Caucus, which is the corporate Democrats. But it sure looked to me like when he was running against Ted Cruz, he changed his spots. He decided to become a populist politician. Dan Pfeiffer, one of the guys who does the Pod Save America podcast. He says that O'Rourke should run based on the enthusiasm he generates. He says he held town halls every night and seemed to enjoy the back and forth with voters that is key to a successful Iowa campaign. He raised $80 million to take on Ted Cruz, and most of it came from online small donations. He used Facebook to live stream videos of everything from his campaign rallies to eating lunch at Whataburger, which got 124,000 views. He talked about racial injustice and police brutality against black people. He won over moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Texas while attracting women and people of color, and won voters under the age of 30 by 42 points. He beat Ted Cruz by 42 points among people under 30. And his race, because he was in the race, he almost won a statewide race, but he helped Democrats win 12 state House seats, 2 state Senate seats, and 2 U.S. House seats. And he visited all 254 counties in Texas. That would make visiting all of 99 counties in Iowa a breeze. In other words, this guy knows how to do it. So is he the guy? Is Beto the guy that can be the one? Or, should we go back to the guy that we know? We know his policies. We know his ability to raise money, Bernie Sanders, who came in third. Or should we stay with, essentially neoliberal economic policies and get Joe Biden? I'm not in favor of that, but, who knows? So anyhow, your thoughts on all of these things. We'll be back in just a moment.